Dr. Schultz, you're the only Schultz I know, except our Secretary of State, George Schultz, who spells his name without a C. And I recall the first day George Schultz appeared at a cabinet meeting as the new Secretary of State. There was a piece of paper identifying where he was to sit, and he had S-C-H-U-L-T-Z. This moved George to tell a story about when he went in the Marine Corps. The sergeant who called the roll couldn't get over the fact we'd never seen his name. When he'd call the roll, he'd always say, Schultz without the C. So I thought of a story that I was told at that point. About a few years earlier, there had been a meeting, an economic meeting in Washington. George Schultz, then Secretary of the Treasury, presided, and the principal speaker was a fellow named Charles Schultz. Charles Schultz spelled his name with a C. He was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, I think under President Carter. And George introduced him, and he said, Charlie Schultz is a good fella, only thing he doesn't know how to spell his name. And also, at this occasion, was the Undersecretary of the Treasury, a man named Charles Walker, who was very instrumental in getting the tax bill passed. And Charles Walker spelled his name with a Charles without an E, C-H-A-R-L-S. And Walker said, well, hell, he said, Charlie Schultz can't even spell his first name. Well, Ronald Reagan was sitting there listening to all this, the cabinet table, and he looked across the table at the Secretary of the Treasury, Don Regan. He says, hell, he said, I've got a Secretary of the Treasury who can't even spell his name either. Well, it's a particular honor as well as a special pleasure for me to bring to this campus, to this center, and to this community the deep gratitude and the great respect which the American intelligence community has and will always have for John Ashbrook, enshrined in the minds and memories of our people, as well as in our archives, is a valiant and successful fight which Congressman John Ashbrook waged on the floor of the House of Representatives to enact the Intelligence Identities Act of 1982. Without John's courage and zeal on that occasion, that law could not have been carried. And without John's courage, you will call it renegade Americans at that time, seeking to destroy the nation's intelligence capability, were revealing, disclosing the identities, the locations, the addresses of officers and agents serving our nation as intelligence officers around the world. Each person named in the publication they sent around became a potential target, along with its family and colleagues, for assassination or for other terrorist attacks. Dick Welch, our station chief in Greece, 1979-80, was fingered by these traitors and assassinated in the driveway of his home while getting out of his automobile in Athens. And we owe it to John Ashbrook that our officers and agents now enjoy legal protection from this kind of dastardly criminal activity, and that this kind of information is no longer published in any regular organized form. So for that, we will never forget John Ashbrook. I also wish to express on this occasion my esteem for Fred Lennon and Ed Losey, and thank them for their support to the Ashbrook Center. And finally, I thank my old comrade in arms and in politics for 40 years, Cliff White, for inviting me here today. I'd like to tell you a little about the American intelligence community. Over the last 6 years, the Reagan administration has made a concerted and I believe successful effort to rebuild this nation's intelligence capabilities. One of the things of which we are most proud is the manner in which we strengthen our dialogue with the academic and business communities of our country. We've learned that if we don't tap the impressive stock of experience and knowledge outside government, our own stock of knowledge will rapidly deplete and will stop being adequate for the task. Speaking engagements like this, numerous conferences which our analysts hold with their academic colleagues on campuses around the country to critique the outside review and the critique of important assessments, which we submit many of our important work to. All this keeps us sharp and open to ideas. I've already spent a very stimulating hour with the fellows of the Ashbrook Center. I look forward to further dialogue and question and answers upon the completion of these remarks. Well, U.S. intelligence is a fairly broad topic. Perhaps the best way to tackle it is to spend a little time discussing the kind of a world and the nature of the conflict our nation faces, and how this in turn determines the mission of intelligence in support of that policy. Students here at Ashland College have the privilege of receiving a splendid liberal education. I know they've been exposed during their studies to the two great, irreconcilably opposed ideas about the relationship between the individual and the state. And the conflict between state despotism and the notion that the highest goal of the state is to protect individual freedoms and creativity has dominated world history for millenniums. And we can't make the mistake of putting this conflict in the past tense. The current competition between the United States and the Soviet Union is the latest chapter of the same conflict that pitted Athens against Xerxes and the Persians, and medieval Europe against Genghis Khan and the Mongols. Unfortunately, this is a history lesson that is not always sufficiently appreciated. It's important that our nation understand just how different the Soviets are from us in their history, their culture, and their outlook. Let's take the Danilov affair as an example. The fact that the Soviets were incapable of making a distinction between journalism and espionage, but perfectly capable of indulging in the most blatant form of hostage-taking, tells us that we are dealing with a fundamentally alien and totally unpalatable value system that threatens our own cherished institutions. If we look at the KAL 747, the Korean airliner shoot-down, we will not get bogged down in the question of whether or not the Soviet Air Defense Command knew for a fact that we're shooting down a civilian plane. All we need to know on that is that the Soviet system was perfectly capable of shooting down a large unidentified aircraft on the mere suspicion that it might have been engaged in espionage. Well, I sort of apologize for starting out on this philosophic note, but it's simply impossible to understand why this country needs a strong intelligence capability if we don't understand why we're engaged in a competition with the Soviets in the first place, and what the real nature and historical context of that contest actually is. 1,000 years of Russian history, reinforced only recently by Marxism, Leninism, tells the Soviet leadership that conflict is inevitable, that the contest for global supremacy is unending, that one side will win and the other lose, and that God, or as good Marxists say, the forces of history, will ensure Russian victory. So what does this outlook mean for us, for U.S. national security, for our intelligence mission? It means, among other things, that the Soviet leadership remains committed to building a military force that could fight and win a conventional or nuclear war. Since the end of World War II, the Soviets have maintained a sizable edge in conventional manpower and firepower in Europe. Some time ago, the Soviets began to relentlessly expand a large arsenal of nuclear weapons aimed at the United States, at Europe, and at East Asia. Today, new missiles and missile-carrying aircraft and submarines are being developed, tested, and deployed in amazing profusion. By 1980, the Soviet Strategic Offensive Forces already had caught up and in some key areas surpassed those of our own. Just one sobering example, the Soviets are today protecting their land-based missile forces by making their missiles mobile and deploying them in a mobile manner. And a mobile U.S. missile, U.S. ICBM, will not be deployed until well into the 1990s at best. That we call a window of opportunity, which the other side has. And perhaps even more alarming, the Soviets are in the midst of a major long-term missile defense program, their own Star Wars, if you will, involving some 10 research and development facilities and thousands of scientists and engineers scattered all over the Soviet Union. They long ago deployed an ABM, an anti-ballistic missile system, around Moscow. They are embarked today on a civil defense program, and have been for some 25 years. A civil defense program featuring a hugely expensive, terribly expensive, and ambitious underground construction and transportation facilities to ensure the survivability of their national leadership in the event of a nuclear war. In missile defense, we are the newcomers on the block. While you will never know it by listening to Soviet propaganda condemning the President's Strategic Defense Initiative as destabilizing, it's hardly surprising that the Iceland talks founded on Gorbachev's assistance, that President Reagan back away from his missile defense. And given the Soviets' impressive strategic gains, they have every reason to want to cut off our government's plans to develop its own strategic defense. The original mission of our intelligence community was the prevention of surprise military attack on our country, another Pearl Harbor, and it still must be our first priority. Thanks in part to American technology and our extraordinary ability to collect information, we're doing a pretty good job on preventing that kind of surprise. But we do have our hands full. The Russians continue through camouflage, concealment, and other measures to deny us critical information we need to assess the current strategic balance or to verify any future arms control agreement that might be negotiated. This means we have to devote enormous resources, a wide variety of human skills and specializations to develop new intelligence collection and accurately assess Soviet nuclear arms control strategies and the characteristics of the weapons that may be deployed against us 10 or 15 years from now. We have to look that far ahead. And much of our budget, much of our time, much of our attention will continue to be dedicated to this central core problem. There was a day a while ago when understanding the military capabilities of our principal adversary was practically our only mission. That day is long past. The world has changed tremendously since the immediate post-war World II era, when we and the Soviets were the only world players that mattered. The number of players has proliferated. Issues have become bewilderingly complex. The pace of change and technological advance almost overwhelming. The world much smaller and far more interdependent. And this in turn has revolutionized the world of intelligence. Some of us don't recognize that Cuba, for example, in our time has become the largest country in the world. It has its government in Havana, has its capital in Havana, it has its government in Moscow, it has its army in Moscow, has its people in Havana, in Miami. And for most of our history, these less developed parts of the world, Asia, Latin America, Africa, have been painfully neglected. A few years ago, the Iranian Revolution made it painfully clear that the longer-term interest and security of the country can be directly at stake out there in the third world. In the wake of our sad experience in Iran, we have significantly expanded our effort to monitor and anticipate instability and unrest in countries of key importance to the U.S. And once again, here we have our hands full. Much of this underdeveloped world is in crisis. One needs to look no further than just beyond our southern border to see a good cross-section of the problem. Crushing debt, a growing disequilibrium in food supply, rapid population growth, and explosive urbanization. But unfortunately, the threat to third world stability does not come solely from such imminent developmental problems. It comes as well from overt and covert Soviet activities aimed at subverting or destabilizing governments friendly to the West. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the primary battlefield in this age-old struggle with totalitarianism is not on the missile test ranges in the Soviet Union, but in the countryside of the third world. In this vital area, the Soviets have been busily testing whether the U.S. will resist foreign provoked and supported instability and insurgency. It has developed an aggressive strategy which avoids direct confrontation and instead takes maximum advantage of third world surrogates like Cuba, Vietnam, Libya, Nicaragua to obtain Soviet objectives. This enables Moscow to deny involvement, label such conflicts as internal, and warn self-righteously against outside interference. This creeping imperialism has, in my view, two primary targets. First, the oil fields of the Middle East, which are the lifeline of the Western alliance. The second one is the isthmus between North and South America. Afghanistan, South Yemen, Ethiopia, as well as Cam Bay in Vietnam, and Mozambique and Angola in southern Africa, all bring Soviet naval power and military power much closer to the sources of oil and minerals on which the industrial nations depend, and put Soviet naval and air power astride the sea lanes which carry those resources to America, Europe, and Japan. And time and again, we watch the Soviets and their surrogates move in to exploit and instigate social and economic discontent. They gain an insurgent base, expand it with trained men and military arms, drive out investment, and wait for another country to fall. And since 1972, they've added 5 new client states in the third world, and today they threaten more than a dozen other regimes via cross-border military operations, insurgencies, and subversion. So all in all, it's not a pretty picture. Marxist Leninist policies and tactics have unleashed the 4 forces of the apocalypse: famine, pestilence, war, and death. Throughout the third world, we see famine in Africa, pestilence through chemical and biological agents in Afghanistan and Indochina, war on 3 continents, and death everywhere. And these occupied countries, in which Marxist regimes have been either imposed or maintained by exiled external forces, there has occurred a Holocaust comparable to that which Nazi Germany inflicted in Europe some 40 years ago. Some 4 million Afghans, more than 1/4 of the population, have been forced to flee their country. In Cambodia, 2 to 3 million people, something like 1/4 of the pre-war population, have been killed in the most violent and brutal manner by both internal and external Marxist forces. Nicaragua, a whole population have been uprooted and deprived of their homes. In Ethiopia, millions of died of starvation. Now, the other side of the coin, there is some good news. The pendulum of history surely is swinging away from Soviet Marxism as a model for these underdeveloped countries and toward the concepts of democracy and free market economics. There was a day not too long ago when Soviet-style collectivism was widely seen as a panacea for the social and economic ills in the Third World. No one, not even the Soviets and their friends, still believe this today. But all Moscow still has going for it is a proven formula for subversion and an undiluted willingness to use raw power to shore up and protect their unpopular client regimes. In short, Moscow increasingly finds itself on the defensive, supporting high-cost, long-term efforts to maintain in power the repressive regimes they have installed or co-opted in places like Afghanistan, Angola, Ethiopia, Cambodia, Mozambique, Yemen, Nicaragua. Right now, today, well over 300,000 resistance fighters, people in these oppressed countries, have taken up arms against the well over 300,000 Soviet, Vietnamese, and Cuban troops which are occupying those countries. So this role reversal, this turnaround, could well be one of the great historical turning points of our lifetime. But it will only work out this way if the indigenous Third World forces resisting collectivism, together with the U.S. and the West, can act to take advantage of this opportunity to open up and advance democracy. Well, how do we do this? First, we need to understand that two can play the same game. Just as there is a classic formula for communist subversion and takeover, there is also a proven method of overthrowing repressive government that can be applied successfully and is being applied successfully in these third world countries. Nicaragua, where a Soviet military base dividing North and South America is being put into place, offers a good example. The new money recently voted by Congress will make it possible to further turn up the heat on the Sandinistas by steadily expanding the number of resistance troops in the field and by opening new areas of operation. I'm not talking about matching the Sandinistas weapon for weapon or for achieving a classic military victory. History shows that a combination of nagging, insurgent, military pressure, and progressive withdrawal of domestic and international support is what brings down or alters an unpopular government. This process already is underway in Nicaragua. The insurgents have made large gains among a people unhappy with Managua's recent collectivization and resettlement programs, as well as unhappy with the Sandinistas' mandatory military draft and anti-church policies. Well, as I said, both we and the Soviets have a lot of stake in the Third World. But nowhere is this more true than Central America. There, the Sandinistas, with a lot of human help, have built an all-powerful state security apparatus, the strongest armed forces in the region, and perhaps most disturbing, have developed a center for exporting terrorism. The Libyans, for example, have been supporting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, little Nicaragua, so far away from them, to the tune of something like $100 million a year. We had a 2-year fight to provide $100 million to the other side. And young men from Latin America are being sent to Libya for training in the terrorist camps there, and then brought back to be planted among the population in Central America, in Venezuela, in Ecuador. And if that regime succeeds in consolidating itself, we can expect that Managua will become the Beirut, the terrorist capital of this hemisphere. Well, our country can immunize itself from this kind of infection. Already hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguans and Salvadorans have fled their countries and headed north. Can anyone doubt that as soon as it becomes apparent that the communists are about to complete their conquest of Nicaragua, another signal will be flashed and millions of people will leave Central America and ultimately Mexico to cross the border into the United States. Now that is a real developing scenario, but there's nothing inevitable about it. We're convinced that with only a very modest military assistance in the West, the anti-communist liberation movements now underway in Nicaragua and elsewhere out there can continue to develop and eventually restore freedom and bring democracy to those countries. But this country's strategy in the third world must go far beyond supporting freedom fighters. Marxist-Leninism may be intellectually, morally, and economically bankrupt, but we are not. In addition to doing what we can to support indigenous resistance to Soviet-backed repressive regimes, we have to come to grips with the core developmental problems of the third world. So I can assure you that we're going to do more at CIA in this area. We moved the huge annual issue of third world stability and freedoms up to one of the front burners in our government. We're seeking to exploit Soviet vulnerability, but we are moving on a broader front as well. For example, we have a team of analysts working to identify Western technologies that can be brought to bear on resources and markets in those third world countries. Our need for people with language capabilities, some experience and knowledge of foreign culture, for third world economists and social scientists had never been greater. As I already made clear, the intelligence profession itself is indeed a lot different than it was just 10 years ago. We've been drawn into other non-traditional areas of collection and analysis at a breathtaking space. In addition to the kind of top-line conflict and confrontation that I've been describing, we face a whole range of international issues that impose increasing difficulties to our societies. International terrorism, industrial competitiveness, the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, international finance and debt, trafficking in narcotics, stolen blueprints, other forms of stolen technology, just to mention a few of the kind of problems that we also have to deal with. And I'm proud of the manner in which we move smartly to extend our reach, to develop new collection methods, hiring and training new types of analysts, new kinds of analysts, utilizing emerging technologies. But in this business, you can't afford to stand still. The KGB and its allied Soviet bloc, Cuban, and other intelligence service and front organizations make up a worldwide apparatus. It is working incessantly to steal our technology, damage our reputation, divide us from our friends, destabilize, subvert, and overthrow governments friendly to us. And CIA is the only organization in the West with the range, the resources, capabilities necessary to deal effectively with this kind of challenge. People there are in action every day, tracking and countering drug runners and gun smugglers, following the some 300 firms engaged in illegal acquisition of our technology, the violent revolutionary organization, terrorist training camps functioning around the world. And we, more than any other organization in the West, have the information, expertise, and resources to do in-depth research across the broad spectrum of international and political, military, and demographic developments, and produce careful assessments of the problems that our country will face now and beyond the year 2000. Some of our new recruits will be charged with unraveling the puzzle of how the Soviet Union and some other countries are setting up hundreds of dummy corporations to illegally acquire our most sensitive research and development. Others will be given the job of charting and the convoluted roadmap of international drug dealing. Others will be charged with the task of exposing and countering the huge Soviet espionage and propaganda apparatus. Many will be given the task of developing new methods of gathering, analyzing, and interpreting data. It was, in fact, an endless parade of new challenges waiting young people in our country. So this, in other words, in short, is an exciting time for us to be working in intelligence now, and an exciting time for those we can attract into our ranks in the years immediately ahead. We are optimists who are trying to open wide that window of opportunity I've alluded to. I don't leave anyone out of the fun. It's an exciting time to be an American. I hope a few will end up in intelligence work, a few people in this school particularly. Most of you won't, but all of you, one way or another, are going to be involved in the huge range of problems I've sketched out for you, and all of you are going to have the opportunity to be part of the solutions. Your generation's commitment to the values established here by Ashland College, your generation's intellectual curiosity and entrepreneurial spirit, its patriotism, and yes, its understanding of history will go far in determining how our nation finally fares in the opening years of the 21st century. So in closing, I'd like to again thank you and the John Ashbrook Center for Public Affairs for this opportunity to talk to you and be exposed to the young people and young ideas that I find flourishing at this institution. Thank you.